Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for a wonderful talk and presentation. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Miguel Acosta, and I'm the director of the San Diego County Library. If you don't know who we are, County Library, we have 33 branch libraries. We have 5 kiosks. We have created a network of 40 Little Free libraries. We have mobile services. We have the 9th largest digital library in the world this year. It's a pleasure to be here and address you and introduce our speaker. Let me say a few words about the setting and the sponsors, and then I will get to our speaker. So tonight's event is sponsored by a consortium we call the San Diego Circuit Libraries. And this is a very special consortium and really kind of a unique partnership between public libraries and university libraries that we don't see too many models nationwide. We're kind of one of the most dynamic consortiums of this type. So it's the county library, as I said. It's also the city's, San Diego City Public Library, and then the university libraries from UCSD, SDSU, Cal State San Marcos, the libraries at University of San Diego and University of San Diego Law Libraries. And I'd like to take a prerogative and have you say hello to Eric Mitchell. Eric, could you stand up, please? Eric is a university librarian at UCSD. And Eric, being the library, is actually the symbol for the entire university, because you know the Geisel Library that inverted and such an we all know it and love it. So thank you, Eric, for attending. I want to say a couple words about our library and how it is that we fit in with supporting this. So the circuit, this consortium we call Circuit Libraries, began as a book lending consortium. So any of our customers could get books from any of our libraries. But it's grown to much more than that, and we're doing programming such like this today. We had a recent effort we called factual health information, so accurate health information, and we had like mini billboards at transit stops so that people can find sources of accurate and truthful and vetted health information. This particular initiative we call Advancing Climate Resilience, Sustainability, and Environmental Justice through Collaborative Programs. So there's several programs. The one tonight is being hosted by us, the County Library. One of the ways we express, the County Library does express sustainability and environmental justice is that we were the first library on the West Coast and the first library in California to join what's called the Sustainable Library Initiative. This is growing to become a nationwide initiative amongst libraries, both public and college and universities, to really participate in a rigorous certification program of that, yes, you are practice sustainable and environmental resiliency in your operations and in your buildings. So for example, in our case, the last 5 libraries we've built are what are known as zero net energy libraries, meaning we produce all the energy we consume over the course of the year through huge solar arrays on our roofs and in our parking lots. And then we do our landscaping is all with California native plants. We have classes on mulching, on composting. We have events sponsored by the Master Gardeners of San Diego to help people to grow their own food, to grow their own plants. And so that's just one expression that the county library is participating in. Enough about us, though. Let's go to our featured speaker. We're very happy today to welcome our environmentalist presenter. Her name is Wawa Gatheru, and she is featured in this book, Love Your Mother. So make sure when we're done, get a copy. Wawa Gatheru is an environmental justice scholar and advocate. She spent her childhood in Connecticut, where both of her parents immigrated from Kenya. Wawa has dedicated her life to making a positive impact on our planet. As a leader in environmental activism, she has been instrumental in raising awareness about the urgent need for sustainable practices and addressing the pressing issues that threaten our planet. Her innovative and inclusive approach to environmentalism has sparked conversations and inspired countless individuals to join the movement for a greener and more equitable world. Wawa remains one of the top climate content creators, featured in an impressive array of features across multiple platforms. Ms. Gatheru is setting a goal to, in her words, create a representative climate movement made in the image of all of us. Wawa uses her talent as a passionate climate storyteller to empower those unheard through the sustainability discussion. In addition to speaking events such as tonight, you'll find Wawa serves on the boards of several important groups: Environmental Media Association, Climate Power, Sound Future, National Parks Conservation, and Earth Justice. And in its inaugural year, the National Environmental Youth Advisory Council welcomed Wawa to serve and provide advice and recommendations to the Federal Advisory Committee at the Environmental Protection Agency. Wawa also has founded her own nonprofit, Black Girl Environmentalist, that we hope to hear more about. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to our esteemed featured speaker, Wawa Gatheru, as we eagerly anticipate the wisdom and inspiration she'll share with us today. Wawa?
Thank you for that kind introduction. Hi, everyone. How are y'all doing today? I'm so excited to be here. This is my second time in San Diego, and I just want to say first that y'all are so lucky. I'm based in Philadelphia, but I'm from Connecticut, a small but mighty state, and it's snowing there. So it's been nice to not be bundled up 24/7 and to be able to spend time in the beautiful landscapes that y'all have. I spent this morning watching the sea lions and the seals. I learned the difference between the two. I also learned that some people don't know how to keep distance from wild animals. Let's not do that. Anyways, I'm so honored to be here. Thank you all so much for coming here today, folks who are here in person, folks that are tuning in virtually. I don't take the ability to talk to people about the biggest issue of all time lightly. I think it's a great privilege, and I think it's a responsibility that I have, and I hope that we all are doing and playing our part in our own unique ways. So I start off always, good evening, I already said that. I'm super honored to be here. My name is Wawa Gatheru. My parents named me Wanjiku. Wawa is a nickname that my friends and family use. And before any accolade or title, I am and will always be a sister, a daughter, a friend, a partner, and a very proud Black Kenyan American woman. Now, I start those titles and parts of my identity before I talk to anyone, really, because they really preface who I am, the ways in which I appreciate and understand the world, but also in how I approach my work and how I understand success in addressing the question that I'm posing here today in this talk. What must we do as a collective to ensurely put forth a just climate future? But before I get to addressing that question, it's really important for me to set the stage and tone for the moment that we're in and focus on the issue that has brought me here today and the issue that drives me every single day. I think we all know right now we are experiencing the greatest existential threat the world has ever seen, the climate crisis. And I use crisis instead of climate change to really accentuate the crisis that we're in. It's one that we have to understand, is one that we have to address right now. From natural disasters to environmental degradation, coupled with governmental inaction and corporate greed, climate change threatens the livelihoods of billions of people and non-human species. Thank you. And while many have characterized the crisis as being a, quote, all-encompassing threat or an equal opportunity stressor, we know that climate change and its impacts are anything but equal. As many of you know, any crisis or catastrophe that takes place in an unequal society will always have unequal impacts. The term or analogy that I like to use is that even though we're all weathering the same storm that is a climate crisis, we are not all in the same boat. In the climate space, we use a lot of terms, a lot of terminologies, but one that we use often in the advocacy space is the term MAPA, which stands for Most Affected People and Areas. And it's a term that we use to make the communities and people that suffer the most from the impacts of the climate crisis more visible. MAPA includes all territories in the so-called Global South, as well as marginalized communities that live anywhere in the world, including the so-called Global North. Just 2 summers ago, Pakistan, who is a MAPA country, experienced an environmental disaster like we've never seen before, with flooding having affected 33 million people, with nearly 1 million homes damaged or destroyed, and families to this day continuing to sleep in roads and makeshift shelters, in schools and mosques. And we see these things happen around the world, and I just heard actually just here in San Diego something very similar happened. Pakistan is a MAPA country as it emits less than 1% of the world's greenhouse gases, but consistently ranks in the top 10 most vulnerable countries to its impacts. Countries like Pakistan bear the brunt of climate change, while high-emitting countries in the global north, like the United States, France, the United Kingdom, failed to substantially reduce their emissions sufficiently or give much media attention to climate disasters happening in those places or even in its own backyard. These dynamics also emerge in regards to gender, for example, positioning women and gender minorities around the world at the forefront of environmental injustice and the climate crisis. Why? Well, when we analyze the root causes of the climate crisis, it's clear that women and gender minorities experience climate change with disproportionate severity precisely because our basic rights continues to be infringed upon in varying degrees around the world. Time and time again, we've seen the ways that enforced gender inequality have reduced the physical and economic mobility of gender minorities, the voice and opportunity of folks, and even have made them more vulnerable to mounting environmental stressors. Black, Indigenous, and other women of color in particular bear an even heavier burden from these impacts because of the historic and continuing impacts of colonialism, systemic racism, and imperialism. And yet, in the midst of this, we know that it's not enough to identify women and gender minorities as being victims. In fact, these positionality actually places us as leaders in these spaces. A 2019 study found that when we place women, for example, in positions of power, we see greater positive outcomes for our environment. This very study found that increasing women's representation in national parliaments, for example, leads to the adoption of more robust climate policies and actually a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and that the participation of women in natural resource management leads to better conservation outcomes. You see, right now we're truly seeing in real time and experiencing that the climate crisis isn't just this issue of decimal points and numbers on charts that most of us can't understand. It's a saga. It's a tale of heartbreak and loss, but it's also a tale of hope and optimism because it's not too late to flip the script. Climate justice is possible, it has to be possible, and we have all the tools to make it happen. Putting women and gender minorities in leadership being a solution that we have within our grasp. You see, the way that I think about it, the climate crisis is the earth giving us very important feedback. It's Mother Earth telling us that the systems that we've relied on for so long aren't working. She's telling us that we need to reprioritize and that we have a once-in-a-species-long opportunity to restructure our world to finally be just for all. There's a quote that I find a lot of solace in, now more than ever, by the incredible Valerie Kerr, who I actually recently met and fangirled. And she says this: "What if this darkness is not the darkness of a tomb, but the darkness of a womb?" I'll say that one more time. What if this darkness is not the darkness of a tomb, but the darkness of a womb? What if we were able to get it right and encourage an era of climate action? What beautiful worlds can we build in that future? And how do we get there? I'm going to talk about that today. I believe that it starts with rehearsing revolution in our everyday lives. Now, I got the idea for this talk after reading a really, really cool book that I read in college called The Labor Drama Experiment and Radical Activism in the Early 20th Century by Dr. Mary McFoy. In this book, Dr. McBoy tells a story of labor colleges that emerged between the world wars. These were schools that were funded by unions that sought to provide members with an adult education while also indoctrinating them into the cause. In the book, she discusses how these colleges use left-leaning drama programs, of all places, to prepare students for the on-the-ground activism emerging across the country. In fact, the thesis of the book is that these amateur stages served as the training grounds for radical social activism in the early 20th century. Now, what if I told you that I believe that we can replicate these dynamics in our everyday lives? That the radical social activism that we need in this moment, in the midst of the climate crisis and so many other mounting social issues, can be done in this time. And that we can actually rehearse revolution in the stages that are our lives and in the relationships that we find ourselves in. I'm a firm believer that we can, and here's why. The great Audre Lorde, who I will reference several times today, once said, "Sometimes we are blessed with being able to choose the time and the arena and the manner of a revolution, but more usually we must do battle where we're standing." It's in this truth that grounds the 4 steps I believe that we need to take as a collective to rehearse revolution in our lives, the steps that we need to take to ensure that we are pushing for a truly just climate future. Now, the first step to rehearsing revolution to me is to contextualize ourselves in the climate story itself, to find our climate stories. Now, I first learned how to do this in my backyard. So a little bit about me, I grew up wedged between 2 histories. In school, I learned that the Black agricultural experience was one purely of subjugation, riddled by centuries of slavery, sharecropping, and exhaustive land practices. I didn't know that there was, or what I had been taught in school was that the experience of Black folks outside was just that there was nothing more. But at home, I knew that that wasn't the full story. I knew that there was more to it. According to oral history, my family has always been farmers, tending the southern sides of Mount Kenya with centuries of ancestral knowledge embedded in our DNA. When my mom first immigrated to the US, she found a home in this history, tending to an overgrown lot in our backyard. She spent weeks hovered over that plot, transforming the weedy allotment into a fertile garden of familiarity. I found belonging in this act of love, spending my earliest summers watching my mom and grandmother as they would tend to the soil, my arms deep in the soil, and just having a blast, being more of a nuisance than a help. I would watch as my mom would somehow pluck these vegetables and transform it into the githeri and the other Kenyan cuisine that I grew up eating. Looking back, I understand that my first contact with the environment was through those tomatoes, was through the food that they were growing. And through that, my first interaction with the physical environment was one of love. It connected me to my heritage and to my family. But I didn't always see it that way. Plainly put, I never really saw myself as an environmentalist. Environmentalism was always presented to me as a top shelf issue, something too white, too wealthy, too out of touch for me to see myself in, let alone my gardening practices as a kid. Of course, I cared about the polar bears and the melting sea caps, but I also cared about a lot of things. I felt like there were a lot of other social issues that felt a lot more close up and more personal and more urgent. It wasn't until I stumbled into an environmental science class my junior year of high school when I was 15 that I began to see things a little differently. And it was because of a teacher. Teachers are the best. I had an incredible teacher, her name is Mrs. Rose, who I'm still in contact with today, who decided for the first time to integrate a chapter on environmental justice, which totally changed my life. In this class, we watched a TED Talk by Peggy Shepard, who was and is still the executive director of We Act, a West Harlem-based environmental justice organization. And in her talk and in her words, I began to connect dots that I had never connected before. In her talk, Peggy introduced me to the concept of environmental justice, to the tradition of environmental justice, and the ways in which Black and Indigenous matriarchs have been protecting our planet for so long. I was introduced to the idea that all people deserve the ability to breathe clean air and to drink clean water, and that all people deserve a safe, healthy, clean environment to live and play. It was here that I connected the dots that if people don't have clean air because of pollution and because of polluters, that's injustice. People deserve clean water. And if people don't have a safe place to live because of climate impacts caused by the oil and gas companies, that's injustice. It was there that I learned that the environment wasn't this far off issue, it was a justice issue. And there was a place for me environmentalism. You see, I learned that care for the environment isn't something outside of me, it's related to everything I care about. My family, my community, my home, and even my personal life. It was in this act of reframing and rediscovery that I found that my deep love for my community, both human and non-human, was enough. Caring is enough and a crucial part in discovering our unique voice in this movement. And the thing is, none of us have to look too far to find it. The climate crisis, like I said before, is a story, and its roots are deeply intertwined with all of us. Here's an exercise my teacher, Mrs. Rose, had us connect to early on in our class that led me to that destination. So if you were to close your eyes, if you're gonna picture the places that mean the most to you. It could be a path that you took as a child, a scenery that you like to go to. Now think of the people that you care the most about. It could be a sibling, a partner, a friend, a parent or grandparent, someone who isn't even here with us. Now, if you think about the causes that you think you'd like to be solved in a just climate future, is it equal access to education? Would you like for a future to have clean water for all people? Transportation for all people to get to their work? What toxic systems do you believe should be abolished and to be built into a new world that's different? Open your eyes. If you can't imagine a world that doesn't include all that you're fighting for, the people and the places and the causes that you're fighting for, a world that isn't inhabitable for those places and people, then we've got some room for you in the climate movement. Now this leads me to the second step that I believe we must take to rehearse revolution in our lives, and that is to feel all of our emotions, especially the ones that we feel most ashamed about. When it comes to existential threats like the climate crisis, I think hope is often propped up as the sole emotional driver of action. At the end of every climate panel I've literally ever been on, I'm asked, what gives you hope? What keeps you doing this? A question I think is well-intentioned and is likely meant to inspire the audience to act on that said hope, to almost borrow it. And while hope is crucial, I believe it's only a part of the equation. In fact, I argue that in its overt prioritization, we're missing out on other emotions that can come up when we get real, when we talk about the climate crisis and the ways that we're experiencing it and the ways that we're seeing it. In order for us to get real about the climate crisis and the deep emotional responses it evokes, it requires us to be real with ourselves. I'll explain. So a couple years ago, I came to a startling realization that I didn't know how to talk about the climate crisis. Now, that sounds really strange for me for a number of reasons. I'm up here, talk about it. I have a nonprofit that's working to get young climate leaders of color into the space. And it's what I've studied for the past 10 years. And yet, through all that screening, through all that education, I realized that I really didn't have the tools or the language to talk about the climate crisis beyond numbers, to discuss how it feels, the emotions it awakens. I'm a young person that grew up in this world with the climate crisis being the backdrop of how I understood the world. And I feel like a lot of people struggle with things like eco-anxiety because they feel as though the circumstances are outside of their reach. I realized I didn't know how to talk about that. Now, I'll also say my education has not been in vain. In fact, my education has been an enabler and a tool. It's provided me a lot of language. It's provided me climate fluency and the tools that have been needed for me to communicate this information from the federal government at the EPA to broader audiences that I work with in my nonprofit. And it's even provided me spaces like this. But I've also been able to reflect on what it hasn't provided me with. So I think in STEM, emotions are avoided like the plague. We're told that climate science is purely objective and that emotions provide leeway for credibility gaps. But I don't believe that's true. Climate change and emotions aren't only compatible, they're inseparable. Because the climate crisis is anything but technical, it's inherently emotional. Like I said before, it's a story of loss and despair, but it's also a story of optimism, and it's a story of abolition. It's a story about the things that we can build. And if we have an obligation to tell the whole truth, then we have to understand that we're not just trying to educate people anymore. A huge majority of Americans do believe that the climate crisis is a thing, that it's happening. People can't ignore the changes that are happening in our worlds. This past summer was the hottest recorded month ever in history, and things are changing rapidly. Right now, we're actually trying to activate people, pushing someone from believing that the climate crisis is this thing to actually doing something about it. And to do so, we have to connect with people emotionally. We have to connect with them and lead them into the action. Audre Lorde once said, "I find I'm constantly being encouraged to pluck out some one aspect of myself and present this as a meaningful whole, eclipsing or denying the other parts of myself." Not being honest about the way that the climate crisis makes us feel denies the parts of ourselves that could be most integral ingredients for action and connection to others. If I'm being honest with you, the climate crisis makes me really pissed off. I'm angry that 100 companies have contributed to 71% of the world's greenhouse gases. I'm angry by the governments that have subsidized the fossil fuel industry while banning meaningful, comprehensive climate policy. And I'm terrified of the future of climate disasters that will continue to hurt the most marginalized around the world, namely Black and Indigenous communities. And I'm fuming that my future isn't certain, that I'm not sure if I want to have children. I'm not totally sure what my life looks like, period. And most of all, the anger is really grounded in the fear that I have for the people and the places that I love so much. A lot of the people and the places that I thought about when Miss Rose had us do that activity. However, after a lot of growth and therapy, I became very aware that those complicated emotions are actually what have driven me to be in this movement for so long. It's been through embracing those emotions that I feel, the ones that I've often been told to feel ashamed about, the anger, the frustration, the hopelessness, the grief, that I've been able to be introduced to hope as a discipline, as something that you earn. Because the thing about these emotions is that they're actually not dead-end emotions. I think that they're an entryway to passion and sustainable activism. Angry people get a lot of things done. They do. History tells us this. We shouldn't shy away from those things because they all are grounded in the radical love that we have for those people and places that I talked about. And as I said before, we can't maintain a climate movement that fails to validate the very things that can mobilize us sustainably in the first place. And what's new is that our love for our beloved communities, as Dr. King says, isn't new. It's actually our generational inheritance, which leads me to the third step, recognizing the fights that we are all collectively inheriting and continuing. When it comes to an issue with the scale and scope of the climate crisis, it's really easy to feel overwhelmed by the weight of the problem. It feels really overwhelming, and it should, especially since everyday people like you and me aren't the ones who brought us into the climate crisis in the first place. But the good thing is that the weight of the world isn't yours alone to hold. It's all of ours. And the fight for a just climate future is connected to every social movement that has come before us. You see, climate change is not our first existential crisis. I started the talk and talked about how it's our greatest existential crisis. It's not our first. We have had 1 billion Black Anthropocenes, as they say. The end of times have come for many communities time and time again, yet there has been a future that has happened. There has been people that have persevered and pushed through. Humans have had to fight for their lives before, and the future truly has not always been certain for all of us. And the story of the climate crisis is actually tied up with the civil rights movement, for example, a lot more than people know, including the environmental movement itself. Let me give you some context on the true genealogy of the climate crisis. So by 1860, enslaved people represented the largest single financial asset in the entire economy, worth more than all manufacturing and railroads combined. And that doesn't include the crops that they produced, the sugar, the tobacco, and of course, the cotton. In other words, enslaved labor subsidized the entirety of American life and the American economy. The entire US economy was built off the backs of enslaved labor. So abolition then represented a tectonic economic shift, similar to the fossil fuel divestment movement does. Now, after the abolishment of slavery, the US launched itself in the Industrial Revolution, where the extractive practice that dehumanized Black and Indigenous life continued and extended into even more widespread extraction of natural resources. It was here, the Industrial Revolution, that we saw the foundation of the fossil fuel industry, the focal culprits of the climate crisis, emerge. Furthermore, the Industrial Revolution that we often discuss in our environmental courses, for example, as being the father of the climate crisis and jumpstarting the rapid increase in greenhouse gas emissions, didn't pay for itself. It didn't just show up out of thin air. It didn't raise itself. It was subsidized with blood money from slavery, chattel slavery, and therefore places the climate crisis as being a direct descendant of and grandchild of slavery and indigenous genocide. This is a genealogy of the climate crisis, and therefore contextualizes the crisis within the very fabric of American history. We're not just in an Anthropocene. Those of you that know the Anthropocene as the geological epoch that we're in, that has been distinguished by human activity, that brought us out of the Holocene into the so-called Anthropocene. There are other terms that actually better suit the circumstance that we're in. For example, the Capitalocene, that says that the geological epoch that we're in is tied to the system of racial capitalism and the extraction and exploitation of both people and planet that have led us here in the first place. Language matters. We cannot solve something we cannot describe. When we think of this history and when we use proper language, it also allows us to place the climate crisis again into the conversation with the civil rights movement and leaders like Dr. King, for example. And connecting that genealogy is really, really crucial. Many people don't know that amongst many things, Dr. King was an environmental justice advocate. Dr. King's protests against poor housing conditions in Chicago in 1966 and his strike in 1968 against unfavorable sanitation conditions in Memphis, Tennessee, are even commonly recognized as helping planted the seeds for what we now understand as our nation's environmental justice movement. And there are countless examples of the ways in which that genealogy between the civil rights movement and the environmental justice movement are very, very clear. It's important that we understand that history and actually take comfort in it, because in doing so, we can understand and really reveal the ways in which the language of progress that we seek in this moment does exist. The language of what it means to fight when tomorrow isn't promised, to be able to conceive of a better day when you don't know how it's going to happen. We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. The language of fighting for another day exists. And the civil rights movement is one that we can really take a look at and get that language from. As we strive to formulate a language of change, it's so imperative that we take refuge in the words that have been left behind by the great social movement leaders that have come before us, that knew a thing or two about liberatory language. The words of Dr. King, Toni Morrison, Audre Lorde, and so many more that knew what it meant to fight and persevere even when the future wasn't certain. And rediscovering their voices and utilizing them in this moment and plugging it into this, be reminded that we don't want to return to precedented times. Instead, we want unprecedented care for our people and planet. With that, I conclude my last step, which is practice revolution everywhere. In the tradition of leaning into the wisdom of those that have come before us, I have to again cite Audre Lorde. Revolution is not a one-time event. When it comes to practicing revolution everywhere, we have to get comfortable making incremental steps that we need to get there. Lucky for us, practice isn't anything new. If you think back to the times when we've had to learn something for the first time, learn something difficult, it seemed impossible, like an insurmountable hill. For example, when I learned how to ride a bike, I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I saw my siblings doing it and I thought I could do it too. It took me almost a year to learn. I got up, I would ride, I'd fall, I'd cry, I'd go to my mom, and I'd do it again the next day. And before long, it felt as though it was second nature. I couldn't remember not being able to do it. My legs had trained themselves, and I couldn't actually forget how to not know how to ride a bike. That's the thing about practice. You fall down a couple times, you pick yourself up, and every incremental moment of practice always makes the goal feel less impossible. And over time, it's hard to comprehend not knowing how to do this said thing. I think the same thing is required for evolution. If we aren't practicing revolution in our everyday lives, if we aren't practicing these dynamics that we want to see in a just future, will we ever be equipped to do it in real time? And practicing revolution means, to me, getting involved in climate action, which I know can feel like a lot, especially since there's not really a straight answer. When someone asks, how do I get involved? You kind of hear the same things. I actually Googled it to see what comes up, and it quite literally is vote, donate, lower your carbon footprint. Those are the top three. And yes, do those things, please. They're important, but they're not the full story. And it's a little more nuanced to get into some of the things like the carbon footprint and how the fossil fuel industry actually came up with that. But that's a whole nother story. But while it's great to do those things, we're rarely asked to contribute our unique voices and our unique talents and really position ourselves to impact our unique spheres of influence. We all don't live single issue lives. We all have different spheres of influence, and there's different ways that we can plug in our voice and our actions in different ways. So how do we get there? How do we find our unique roles and apply ourselves? I want to introduce you all to this activity that was created by Dr. Ayanna Johnson. It's called the Climate Venn Diagram, and it's meant to create a constellation of the different possibilities that each individual can take for getting involved in climate action. And it's the climate Venn diagram, but you could really use it for anything. So if you think of a Venn diagram, 3 overlapping circles that come together in the middle, there's one circle that you would write the things that bring you joy, sources of satisfaction and delight, the things that make you smile, maybe the things that get you up in the morning. Then another circle would be, what are you good at? What are the things that if you were in a group project with your closest friends and family, they'd immediately say, yeah, you're gonna be doing that. You're not gonna be doing this. And what works needs doing. So I think when it comes to the different climate issues in our communities and issues around sustainability and equity, I think that's the easiest part of this. There's so many problems, but that's also exciting because there's so many things that we can fix and contribute our voice to. So if you take some time and do that activity, hopefully at the end of it, in the middle, you'll find a mini little constellation of how you can take your first step. Now, I do this every year for my annual year resolutions, and then I put them up in my room so I can kind of track the different ways that I'm growing or thinking about the world and how I'm using my voice. And I really recommend that you use it for figuring out how you can take your next step in climate activism or activism in general. Now, I'll end with this because I want to also answer a lot of questions. I think it's a really important perspective that I want to share with you that I have been holding on for a long time. I think all of us can agree when I say that none of us have ever known a perfect world. Like many other Gen Z, I grew up on the heels of 9/11. I learned my ABCs against the backdrop of Hurricane Katrina. That was my first memory of looking at the TV. And I watched as my parents and loved ones fought to stay afloat in the 2008 financial crisis and have been in the midst of so many once-in-a-generation crises since then. Many of us are the first in our families to be in this country, first to attend college, and have had to fight tooth and nail to navigate this country, the institutions that we're in, and to navigate what it's like coming up in a time in the climate crisis and so many mounting stressors that feel like a generational free fall. But in the midst of all of this, there has been a truth that has remained constant. While none of us have never known a perfect world, we've never needed a guarantee of success to try to strive for one. Because this world, as imperfect as it is enough to want to fight for. I think that is what we have to hold on to in this moment. Thank you.
You did just touch on this one, but I will reiterate it in case there's anything you'd like to add. This community, Southeast San Diego, was one of the hardest hit areas during the recent floods. What can we do today or this week to have an impact?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I have to say that I wasn't even aware of the floods until someone took some time to tell me about the area and the history and what has recently happened. To my understanding, I think when something like this happens, the community is hurting. And at the same time, it also makes visible a lot of the inequities that already exist. I talked a little bit about how a community or society that already has unequal dynamics, in the midst of a natural disaster or any impacts of the climate crisis, those things just become more visible. We can see that with the coronavirus as well. So I think right now the best thing to do is listen to community members. People know what they need. People know how to communicate that. So listening is always really important. I think sometimes for folks that might not be experiencing the thing firsthand, there can be this desire to kind of helicopter in and just help and just be overwhelmed with the good intentions. But I think listening to community members, finding the different spaces that folks find refuge in a variety of different ways. I find that different community centers, churches are always a great way to connect with people, and usually there's already infrastructure there that happens year-round. But also I'd say, I really have to lean back on the listening end of things and just being open to supporting in ways that even you didn't know were a possibility, and being flexible with that.
While we're listening, we might also turn to some leadership. So the next question is, can you talk about how you see womanism and feminism connecting to climate justice?
Yeah, no, I think it's really central. And like I said before, I think language is really important. So there's tons of terms. There's ecofeminism, there's eco-womanism. I identify as an eco-womanist. Eco-womanism is a framework that understands the unique expertise that come from Black and Indigenous matriarchs from around the world. For example, Indigenous people protect 80% of our world's biodiversity, for example, and there is a generational expertise there that I think that Western science and institutions have for so long called backwards and are now going back to in this moment and realizing how integral those knowledge systems are. And I mean, it's absolutely critical. I think something that's a bit frustrating is whenever we understand a demographic as being uniquely impacted by the climate crisis, for example, or any other issue, the immediate response is to infantilize the group. It's to say, oh, I'm so sorry that's happening to you. I know the solutions, I can help you. And it kind of goes back into the listening, but actually going back to listening, I think it actually, the step further from that is to really intrinsically understand that folks that are experiencing the things firsthand also know the solutions because folks are creating solutions as a means of survival. And women around the world and gender minorities as well. And I talk about that as well because when we go back into data around how we know that women are experiencing the climate crisis first and worst, we actually don't have comprehensive data on the ways that gender minorities are. For example, our gender nonconforming folks. But when we understand the inequities that exist for these groups of people, we can understand that in the face of the climate crisis, those dynamics are still being replicated. So there's this big need, I think, in our academic silos as well to expand the demographics that we are really looking into, because we can't solve an issue, again, if we can't describe it, but also when we go into the more practical end of things, you can't get funding for something if you can't point to numbers And when folks are being left out of the demographic data in the first place, then that already tells you that there's a disparity and there's an inequity there. So yeah, women and gender non-conforming folks are really at the forefront of this movement. I see it every single day in organizing spaces. The environmental justice movement itself was created by Black, Latin, and Indigenous women in this country that continue to not only uphold this movement, but countless others. And I think it's very evident. So we just need more of those folks in leadership and more of us supporting them to do the work that they're meant to do and well positioned to do well.
Good evening. What is even a small example of corporations or industry taking positive steps to reverse their negative actions that hurt the environment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a big conversation. I'll try my best to answer that question, but there's this big conversation right now around climate reparations. So we understand reparations as being this policy measure that can attempt to rectify to some degree the ways in which communities have been systemically oppressed by the nation state. But there's a lot of conversations in the climate reparation space around whether or not we want climate reparations or climate investments. So meaning some people are calling for corporations like the fossil fuel industry to be abolished completely and to, have them end. And then some people are saying, okay, we understand that these business practices are inherently wrong, but what if you were to slowly reinvest your funds and then slowly absolve yourself? There's different theories of thought around it. I'm still spending a lot of time learning myself, but in regards to positive examples, so I run a nonprofit called Girl Environmentalist. Running a Black youth-led nonprofit is very hard. Climate philanthropy is already a really hard space for anybody. So anyone who's ever trying to get funding in climate or environmental issues, you probably know what I'm talking about. Climate is the least funded issue out there, out of any issue. So we're already there. And then when we bring in, for example, women-led environmental organizations, climate organizations, they receive 0.2% of climate philanthropy. And then when we think about youth-led climate organizations, we receive 0.076%. So then when you bring folks that live at the intersection of the two, where's the money and where is it coming from? So it ends up being a lot of situations where we have to figure out what are other ways for us to sustainably resource ourselves outside of the traditional foundations that are very difficult to, get in contact with, have a lot of backward practices of kind of word of mouth, which already is like, if you're in those spaces, you're in those spaces. If you're not, and oftentimes it's not frontline communities that are anywhere near those institutions of power in the first place. So an example of an institution that is supporting my organization, for example, we have a fellowship program called the Hazelden Johnson Fellowship Program, which is named after the mother of environmental justice, Hazelden Johnson from Chicago. And we place early career Black women at climate internships for the summer. And we provide them, not only require our partners to pay them a livable wage, but we also cover a $5,000 living stipend for the folks for the 10 weeks and have an in-person summer retreat. Why? Because we know that the internship space is still one that is getting better. We're taking down unpaid internships, which is great, and compensating people for their labor, but it still can be really difficult for people to meaningfully intern or be able to choose and apply to organizations that they want to, because cost of living is awful. It's awful everywhere. So when we provide folks a $5,000 living stipend, that allows for people to really spend the summer meaningfully contributing, hopefully pushing the needle in those organizations and networking in the ways that they need so they can continue to engage in the green economy space. And a lot of people would be surprised to know that the way that we were able to pay for our fellows to have this $5,000 living stipend was because of Stanley Cup. You know the cup that just went viral? Now, I will say, that happened a lot after. We didn't see that coming, and there's a big conversation on consumerism and that. But it wasn't some climate foundation that was interested. I've sent in hundreds of grant applications. I know how important this program is, but it was Stanley who stepped in, and right now is spending $500,000 on grassroots environmental organizations. I can't speak about their supply chain right now because I think a lot of things are underway, and we signed that before all of this happened, but I think that's a really great example of this is a company that makes a lot of money, and they are distributing some of their wealth to organizations that are struggling in other ways. And I think that there can be tons of other companies that do so. But I think there is a corporate responsibility for for-profit entities to really diversify the ways in which they're doing their social giving if they're doing that. Yeah.
Amazing speech, so thank you so much for that. And whoever asked that first question, I'm happy to direct you. I echo the idea of listening, but also the Jackie Robinson YMCA has been a source of resources and volunteering. Happy to give you more information about that. As a thought leader, what have you seen has been the most engaging sort of messaging for Gen Z and Alpha? Just how do we bring them into the fold and not scare them away or
Alpha
speak
scares me. They're
Same.
Do y'all know how old the alphas are? Yeah, they're like the 14 to the babies. I don't even know what's going on with them. All my nieces and nephews are Gen Z too, so I'm still struggling with the alpha thing because now I'm experiencing that I want to seem cool with the alphas, and I'm like, oh, this is how it feels. But I can speak to the Gen Z experience. I apologize. I actually should have spoken a little bit more about the climate anxiety piece. But climate anxiety is this phenomenon in which people are experiencing anxiety because of whether they've experienced the impacts of the climate crisis and natural disasters firsthand, or it's like the impending impact. It's like every time you go on your phone, there's something going viral about this natural disaster. You see someone's going through this thing. You go outside in the summer and you're realizing that you're super, super hot. You turn on the news and see that somebody passed because of the extreme heat. We don't have the infrastructure in our cities. We have so many things going on. There's a lot of doomism, and I think this movement has, for a really long time, relied on the doomerism and apocalyptic narratives to get people, and I just don't think that's a winning strategy. Like, I think that some people can be swayed to act because of fear. I certainly was, but that's not what sustained me. I talked about anger sustaining me, and that is real too, and spite as well. And there are a lot of other positive things too, but just gonna put that out there. I think that we need messaging that really leans into a lot of abolitionist frameworks. I think when people hear like abolition, they immediately just think, I don't know what people think about abolition. I think they honestly just associate it with being negative. But at its core, abolition is not just about tearing the thing down. It's about having radical imagination and dreaming up of better systems. It's basically understanding that if something is sick or something is fundamentally wrong, we have to rebuild a new system to make sure that there is transparency and that there are structures that can be built upon. If the foundation is crumbling, then what's the point of going any higher? And I think that when we use language that leans into radical imagination, uses language that really validates the experiences that people are having with climate anxiety, we're more likely to be able to connect with people. And I think also leaning into joy. I have a lot of fun in the climate space. I think a lot of people sometimes are like, you must be depressed all the time. And I am, and it's not just because of the climate crisis. But at the same time, like, what brings me a lot of joy is the fact that I have the privilege of my life, the people in my life are all doing things. I'm seeing people using their voice in different ways. I'm seeing people deciding to I guess to be the change they want to see. And I think if we had more positive stories of the people doing the things, we would be telling the full story. Because if we have all this clickbait, journalism and TikToks and climate doom going viral all the time, it actually gives us an improper version of the world. It's a version of the world of we are all seated with this anxiety and immobilized and doing nothing, and that's not the truth. People are doing things. People have always been doing things. Unfortunately, I guess those stories aren't as sexy. I think that they are. So I think sometimes that's also just like seeing who's doing the things in the community. Like, I think you're doing really cool work, for example. And there's always people that are doing cool things. So connecting with those folks, and I think using more optimistic language is really key for Gen Z. Gen Alpha, I don't know. I guess might have to ask the Gen Alpha.
I have a question. For those of us in the audience or those who might be watching, recording later, who are interested in seeing future developments in your work, is there a website or social media that you wanted to share with us so we can stay in touch, so to speak?
Thank you for that question. I spend most of my time, I run Black Girl Environmentalist. Black Girl Environmentalist is a national organization that's working to invest in the next generation of Black women and Black gender expansive folks in the climate sector. So people of color make up nearly 40% of the US population, but we don't exceed a 12 to 16% green ceiling in the climate movement, from advocacy to the green workforce. And those numbers are actually much worse. It's a Green Report 2.0, and that's actually something that organizations can opt to fill out. It's not a requirement. So we know that the green movement isn't the most diverse, and I think it should be. I think that it should be, not diverse. I think it should be the most diverse space because it pertains to our lived experiences, our planet, our natural and built environments. And so with BGE, we're using the impact areas of narrative change, workforce development, and community empowerment to really invest in the next generation. We have 12 hubs across the US that have hub leads that put on monthly engagements for their community to really network and convene. And we're also creating our own programs that are meant to really address the pathway and retention issue, because Black women have the lowest retention rate of any demographic. So even when we are joining the space, we are the most likely to leave. So we have, for example, an HBCU and community college mentorship program that pairs those students up with Black women and gender expansive folks that are already leading in their respective disciplines. We have the Hazel and Johnson Fellowship Program I was talking about before, and we also co-host the BIPOC Green Career Summit in DC, which essentially brings together green recruiters and early career folks of color and women to basically connect with those folks and get jobs. So you can follow us on our website at blackgirlenvironmentalist.org. We're on social media. We're always looking for partners. You don't have to be a BGE to get involved. People always ask about this. I think that our organization is contributing to the health of our movement. We can't push for a movement that doesn't speak to everyone. And I think that having a movement that is representative of us all actually helps us all. So we're always open to partnerships. We don't have a hub in San Diego, but always looking for partners. So if anyone ever wants to do anything with us, we're really cool.
Let's thank Wawa one more time.